Hey everybody, welcome back to Dungeon Brew. Today we are talking about world building again, and more specifically we're going to be talking about politics. And to start this off, I'm going to have Joshua talk a little bit about some of the hiccups and some of the problems people run into when they first start diving into politics as a part of their world building.
Are you looking for a new grim, dark steampunk setting to introduce to your players? Well, Dungeon Brew has created a campaign setting manual called Thigum, and it is now available for your support on BackerKit. It has new rules for magic disruption in regions. There are rules to create your own corrupted gods to introduce to your players. There are new rules for mechanics in regards to the firearms for the new steampunk weapons that are being introduced, and there is new magic, new species, new subclasses, new factions, and so much more that's being included in this manual. You can go download a PDF sample on the BackerKit and see what all we have put into it, but right now we need your dice at our table, so head on over. We'll see you there.
Yeah, so politics is a complex topic, probably more complex than what most of us realize. I think for the great majority of us, politics is like this really huge organization that is beyond our perception, and we just kind of get what the world throws at us or what media throws at us about politics, and we usually narrow it down to kind of this black and white mentality when we come to think about it. It's good, it's bad, it's right, it's wrong, and we don't necessarily see all the interlocking pieces of gray and difficulty that actually go into what people do day to day in the political realm. And so in creating politics in your world, I think that sometimes we as DMs fall subject to that, where we start looking at governments as being really positive or really negative. We have that king that's just a goody two-shoes, really benevolent, and he's doing everything for his citizens, and he does everything for the adventurers, and he's got this really kind heart. And then we have, your dictators or your tyrants that are just evil towards everybody and raising taxes and slaughtering people and supporting slavery and all sorts of whatever negative things we can think about we put underneath his regime. And I think that's something that many of us struggle with when we dive into politics. I mean, it's just this idea that we kind of take away the gray that really does exist in the real world, and we make it a very black and white scenario for our characters.
Yeah, very much like a damsel in distress type thing. So you have the good king who does well by his citizens and that type of thing, and then you have the evil tyrant who needs to be removed. It's very comforting to think about politics in that way, that there's a good government and a good nation, and there's a bad government and a bad nation. And like you said, in reality, there's much more of a scale of good to evil. None of them are 100% one direction or the other direction. They pretty much all exist somewhere in that middle area. Some lean more towards good, some lean more towards evil. You definitely have tyrants in the world. You definitely have governments who try and do well by their citizens, but that doesn't mean that all of them are perfect or all of them are completely unsalvageable. So, that's a very interesting place to start, just in making the world feel more real and having that neutrality and that gray area that exists in good and evil.
And I'm not really sure where that dichotomy came from, to be honest. You might be well versed in sharing some of that. I mean, D&D used to have like this take where even monstrous classes had motivations, and you could have them join your party, or was not every bad guy was necessarily evil that immediately invoked a battle. But over the years, it feels like there's this separation between good and evil, and that's bled over into the political realm as well when we look at that.
I'm not real sure. I mean, I think that it kind of goes back and forth. It depends on the table, depends on the people who are running it. Because I think the older systems had morality things, which sought to make monsters feel more less bloodthirsty, more prone to fear and panic and that type of thing, which doesn't necessarily buy into like good or evil necessarily, but it does establish that they are prone to emotions that cause them to fail in moments of trial. But in recent years, I know that there's been a push to, ensure that things like orcs are not always evil or chaotic, and drow are not always evil and chaotic. There's more of a push of the notion of neutrality in some of the traditionally evil or chaotic races or creatures that exist in the world. And previously, there were pretty much extensively chaotic, but also they are, like I said, they're more prone to failure. They're more prone to human style emotions in the sense that they are interested in self-preservation more than anything else. And a marriage of those things, I think, would be a good push.
So building off of that thought, I think that's where we're aiming at looking at politics as well. And when I think of politics, I think about governments, I think about laws. And when I think about building those in my world, I'm looking at a sense of neutrality and things being a certain way for a certain reason. Usually people come into power because of something that put them into power, or laws are written because there is some sort of issue that needed to be resolved, and a specific law was an attempt at resolving whatever that issue was. Typically in world building, and even in real life, we have two typical elements or components that provide some sort of structure for citizens, especially mass amounts of citizens, and that's religion and politics. So when I'm looking at world building politics, I'm looking at what specific government needs to be put in place for this region based on their history and their people and their economics and the regions around them. What laws need to be put in place in order to manage these people based on those same factors as well. And I guess not only looking at that at maybe at a superficial level, but also at a very deep, intricate level of why are these politics here and why are they important?
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good thought, actually, and that kind of kicks off a couple of things in my brain that I hadn't actually thought about until this moment, in which you have there are values that exist. We talked about culture already, we've talked about religion already, but going back into culture, I think specifically, that I think helps to inform the type of government that you get. If you have a culture that values things like deeds, so a Norse type culture, the way that they saw virtues oftentimes had to do with deeds. If you did a deed that was heroic in some way, that was considered good. And if you did deeds that were non-heroic in some way, lying or cheating or stealing or something like that, those were often seen as bad things. And so you would oftentimes have leaders who weren't necessarily great leaders. Like they weren't skilled in any way specifically that made them good at what they did, but they had a long list of deeds behind them, and because they had a long list of deeds, they ended up being leaders, potentially kings. And that is in and of itself a system of government. It creates a government that does not necessarily exist for good or evil or anything else. You get a random person who happened to do some things. They may be very physically powerful, and that results in them basically creating their own nation in a certain regard. But that doesn't mean that they're good rulers. They could be great rulers. They could be terrible rulers, but it doesn't matter because the reason that they got into power had nothing to do with their ability to lead people. And that type of culture, I think, is something that you can pay attention to, or culture in general is something that you can pay attention to when you talk about how these governments came into being, how their political associations and that type of thing existed. And when we're talking about Greece, then we get into things like democracy and republics, because they value things like philosophy and poetry. They value the thought rather than the deed. In most cases, there are people in Greek history who are famous for their deeds, but there are a ton of people who are famous in Greek history because of the things that they said and the things that they thought. And those are things that affected the way that the governments in the Greek peninsula ended up developing over time.
Yeah, and it went through a number of different changes in how exactly it functioned. I mean, usually when we think about ancient Greece, we're probably thinking about like an oligarchy or with
Sparta, right?
Yeah, or even their sense of democracy with the Senate and that type of thing. But it actually had a lot of different things that occurred during that time that are worth researching if you're wanting to build your world in that aspect.
Right.
Now, John, I know you and I have done a number of interesting things with governments. I know we both like to play with that. We especially like to play in the gray area with governments and make it more challenging for our players. They don't just have that evil tyrant or that benevolent king. But when you're looking at government, where do you start at? How do you build politics as a large, not even government, how do you build politics with the government, both at the local level and then also at the global level?
I try to think about like how it's developed over time. So I think probably the easiest one to think about was the Khazar Karath campaign that we did, or that I ran, and I had a couple of bodies of senators, roughly. We'll call them that for ease of interpretation. But there were two separate bodies of senators, and then there was an actual monarch. I think I structured it closely off of like the British government in the sense that there's a monarch, but there's like parliament and that type of thing. Except that the monarch still had far more power in terms of governance, and so there was a different skew to it. One of the things that I did is I just made sure that when I was going through and I was identifying individual senators, I was giving them personalities. So I wasn't just going, well, this is a good senator, this is a bad senator. You know, you don't come up across one of these people that exist in that world and they're, you know, twirling their mustache and obviously evil. It's difficult to tell. And they themselves do not view themselves as being evil. And I think that that's a very key component of how you represent real people in the real world. Is even the most vile people in the world generally don't see themselves as being villains, and the few who do are generally very obviously evil. I think that there's a couple of dictators that you could probably point out who relish in the fact that they're dictators and they relish in the power that they have. But when you're talking about this style of government, you're not going to see that. You're going to see real people acting in a real way with real motivations based off of their experiences. And those experiences may or may not have been correctly informed based off of a number of factors, including cultures and history and other things like that. So I imagine...
Oh,
go ahead. No, you're fine. You're fine.
I was going to say, I imagine then that when you take it out of the local view or the local region and you're looking at region compared to other region, you're building something similar, but essentially behind the motivations of regions and how their individual political structures are put together, and then how they conflict, or what's the word I'm looking for? How they conflict or complement one another.
Right. So in that specific scenario, the Khazar Karath government was reflected by the Azar Kazakh government, which is a neighboring dwarven settlement that at one point in the history those two countries split up. So there was a big nation that got split into two nations, and they're in conflict with each other despite having relatively similar governments. That is history that is affecting the way that they view one another. This might be something similar to what you see between England and France. They're both monarchies. They both have very tightly wound histories in which the aristocracy and the ruling class in English history was largely French and Norman, and so you have that affected the way that those people interacted, despite having a similar government. Now, the other side of that is going, maybe you have two nations that really have never been in conflict, but they have such different governments that there's a tension that exists between them. And that might be the notion of this democracy or this republic versus this monarch. And so how does the democracy, who tends to probably tout more freestyle speech and things like that, opinions and that type of thing, approach approach a system that has a single ruler versus the single ruler who might see the democracy as a threat to his power. Even if he himself is generally a good ruler, he's concerned about the history of the nation, the traditions of the nation, his children, and what they might inherit, and those types of things. All of those things, the relationships between the different countries that exist in the world, can be affected by things like history and the conflicts that they've had in the past, which I think we've talked about already. They can be affected by things like politics and the different types of government that they have. And having different governments can cause conflict, and otherwise there wouldn't be any, or there's no reason for it. We've talked about economy, because if you have a landlocked nation and then you have other people who exist around them who are preventing or allowing trade, that affects who your allies and your enemies are. There are a number of different things that go in there, and all of them should have more subtle reasons than I just want power.
I agree. I think that, just to kind of sum up, there are a lot of different options out there for politics, governments, and laws that you can kind of put into your different cultures or into your different regions in the world as you're building it. I mean, the list is just long and complex. I think the best thing to do is just not look at it in a black and white view. It's looking at that there's different colors and different ways of approaching it that can be meaningful. And as you're building that, whatever nuanced pieces that you put into those specific regions and however you're building it are going to bring it to life for characters and make it feel more real for them.
Right. It's very much the same thing we've talked about in the past. It's you don't have to get into specifics on everything. When I'm talking about the Khazar Karath campaign and giving senators specific histories and backstories, that was a campaign that was specifically set in a city that was designed to be a political campaign. It was necessary on my part to build those things out. If you have a group of adventurers who are passing through a region, you don't need to go into that detail. It's backbreaking and unnecessary in certain regards. But when you're talking about world politics, world building, it's a good idea to treat maybe each nation that is in, the area that you're concentrating in as being a personality. Think about the history of that nation. Think about its culture. Think about its experiences. Think about its conflicts. Think about its successes. All of those things going together to make a personality for the nation as a whole. And then how does that personality, how does that individual nation compare to other individual nations? Are they going to be friends? Are they going to be enemies? How do they approach one another? And those are helpful ways at looking at things. And in the case of Khazar Karath and Azar Kazak, did they have a divorce? Are they still are they still fighting for custody over a region that both of them feel like they should have? But I think that thinking about the nations as individual people and then giving them some flesh helps you to establish maybe a more realistic approach for what the world should look like.
Yeah, I love that example. Please let us know what else you want us to talk about on this topic. I know that John and I both run a lot of political campaigns. I'm in the midst of one right now that I'm also doing. So this is something, again, that we can come make additional videos on if people want to know more about political structure and how to build, maybe even specifically, a political campaign.
Dungeon Brew.